thank you for doing that. And how exciting that there are people from so many places in Iowa, let alone so many places on this campus, interested in impacting the lives of young people in some way. And what I hope you'll take from today is just the fact that this broader impact thing is doable. It is something that we are all doing in our lives every day. It's just how do we take it and integrate it into the lives we have so that we become comfortable with it. So I'm going to give you some tips and tools and some things of the over 30 years that I've been doing evaluation work. And the way that I came to program evaluation, I was hired in 1981 to be a 4-H agent in a county of 32,000 people on Lake Superior. And I thought the only thing I would have to do was stay warm, and that's all I needed to do. Well, I did a lot of activities with young people, and my background is in environmental studies, and so I did a lot of science with kids and a lot of outdoor things. We'd study snowflakes, we'd study all kinds of things. And my first performance review with my district director, he said, "You are doing great activities with young people and the adults who work with young people, but you haven't evaluated them." And I was like, what the hell is that? I'd never heard of evaluation. It was never part of my training. I was trained to be an environmental scientist. I was not trained to be an evaluator. And so the next summer, I took a class from Michael Patton and Dick Krieger at the University of Minnesota on evaluation. And that's what got me started in 1982 to think that evaluation was the coolest thing that you could do to really tell your story about your work in a way that wasn't boasting. Because many of you have probably grown up in families like mine where you don't toot your horn. It is something that if you do good work, that's all that's enough. And so to really be able to say good things about your program, evaluation gave us an excuse to do that and tell that story. And I discovered that by doing this evaluation, there were lots of unintended outcomes. Many fun people who came to work with us on our projects because they heard about them. Money, in some instances, literally fell from the sky to do some parts of the project. Some projects took on a life of their own. And sometimes we actually were able to bury the things we didn't want to do, but people told us we had to because we had proof they were not working. And so sometimes evaluation can be a really good friend. So, an overview of some of the things I just want to mention. These are very basic. I don't want to get wound up into the details of randomized control trials and all that kind of stuff. You can leave that to when you're ready for methodology. Basically, want to talk about why is it that we want to assess K-12 outreach programs? Why is that important? What should we take a look at? How should we do it? What are some tips and what are some resources to help you do that? So, why should we actually think about evaluating or assessing or monitoring? People use a variety of words. I'm not going to define any of them because in your realm, you know which words you need to use and what they mean. What's been discovered is 2/3 of our government programs related to STEM since 2005 have not been evaluated. So people are giving away money or doing things and they don't even know whether or not they work, or they're not taking the time to tell that story. So if in fact you have evaluated your work with young people, you are more apt to be able to be funded and to have the attention that you need. Evaluation serves to improve, not prove. And that is something, I'm a member of the American Evaluation Association. This is oftentimes a phrase that is used. You'll hear Michael Patton use it frequently too. Really, assessment is we are trying to show that something is working or not working. We're trying to improve upon what we're doing. We're trying to improve on the activities that we have. We're not trying to show causation. We leave that to research. Now, you may combine, as part of NSF, because it is really about science, a research project as part of your evaluation. We want project quality. We want to find out what works. We want to find out what doesn't work. We want to do some new and different things. We also want to take a look at products that come out of our projects. And we heard about impact this morning from Mac and Mari, the morning show. And that impacts are really the cool thing right now. They are the coin of the realm. And you saw Mac put up that logic model that shows short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And truthfully, people aren't really interested in the short-term anymore. They really don't want to know what it is young people are learning. They really don't care. They want to know what young people are doing differently as a result of what they're learning, and then how that impacts the conditions in our world. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. We want to improve our science, our pedagogy, and our equity and diversity. And for some people, it is more of that social justice kind of piece that drives the work. For other people, it's about coming up with the best possible teaching, delivery methods, learning processes. For others, it's improving the science. So whatever that goal might be for you, and you may have another one that you put there, but sometimes real reasons for assessing is to see whether or not we're making a difference in those larger pieces. And then, of course, we want to improve STEM. We also want to improve youth development, the ways we help young people become better people, and we also want to do organizational development. So there may be in the unit that you represent an interest in doing evaluation or assessment to improve your unit, make it better, make it more efficient, more effective, whatever it might be. So why are we being pushed to assess K-12 outreach? Some of this will seem extremely familiar, the broader impacts. It's something that's been added more recently. We're seeing it in many environments. We're seeing the standards-based movement, K-12. Has anybody been part of that? Seen that we've got standards we have to meet in school systems? Yes. That's become a national process that's becoming more and more entrenched, and now it's become part of the culture rather than the spaceship that landed. Program planning and reporting. People are constantly being asked to plan various things and report on them, and that requires assessment data to be able to use the planning process and to report out. We have the evidence-based movement. You couldn't possibly do anything with young people in the way of a program or a curriculum unless there's an evidence base behind it that says this curriculum works and it delivers these particular outcomes using randomized control trials. That is a very huge part of what funding is going towards now. I work with a program that's the #1 intervention program in the world, and we receive huge amounts of attention because we have that criteria behind us. If you're not evidence-based, you need to put forward the fact that you are working towards creating that evidence base. We have the return on investment movement. Mac and I were chatting a little bit during lunch about the social return on investment movement. A lot of our decision makers want to know for every dollar they invest in you or your program or the young people you're working with or the teachers you're working with, how much is that return? Because they want to see at least equal, they want to even see more, at least double or triple, quadruple or more of a return on that investment. So if they give you $100,000, they want you to be able to prove that you're returning at least $300,000 in value. Political context, government relations, the kinds of people that we're working with these days, really the privilege is about economic development. And so we're seeing workforce development as part of that. We're seeing trying to be more globally competitive through STEM occupations, whatever it might be. But that's privileged, and so that is really also pushing our assessment context. And then finally, we need to get beyond the feeling good about the work with youth. So Mari said this morning you have kind of the feel-good sheets that you fill out, like how was the food, what was the temperature of the room, what did you think of the speakers? You know, people really don't care that much about that anymore. That got us through for several decades as being considered an assessment of our work. Well, those contexts, if we haven't figured out now what good food is, what a good meeting room is, and who good speakers are, we really should be doing other work. So what should we assess? I kind of think of 3 different realms. This is one realm, is that personal assessment. How are you doing, or your unit or your organization, in your outreach competency? Maybe you're a pure research unit and all you're used to doing in the way of outreach is I've published a paper and it's out there. Maybe now, because of doing this K-12 youth outreach work, you have to figure out what is it about working with young people in schools and teachers and organizations and communities, and you're learning how to do that and build those kinds of competencies. And maybe you want to assess how you are doing or how your group is doing in building that. Oftentimes in many of these grants where it's imperative to have community partners engaged as co-PIs or important members of the organization, you've never done that before. You may want to spend time figuring out how that is working. The team process, again there, maybe you're bringing together an interdisciplinary group of people to work on a grant. Some people resist that because they know if they can be the lone PI, they can control everything and they can just move along because they know how to depend on themselves and how to work with themselves. Add in 2, 3, let alone 15 people representing a huge variety of disciplines or ways of being or communities, that can make the team process very challenging. And again, oftentimes we're not trained to be team leaders. So you may want to assess how is our team process going, and especially if one of the goals of your grant or your project is to actually build networks or to build teams or to build collaborations. Adult-youth partnerships. We forget that part of the K-12 youth outreach are the young people. We sometimes forget to work directly with them and assess how are we doing as adults working with young people. It amazes me when I find people who are PIs on grants who really don't want to work with young people. They just really want to create more scientists. And I'm like, get a life, go do something else. This is really about young people. This is the reason we're doing this. And you can tell I have a bias. My background in youth development says this is not just about science. This is about the science of youth development as well. You may also want to assess your cultural competence. If your grant is focused on reaching underrepresented audiences, you may want to assess how do I personally or how does our team do that. You may want to do climate surveys and studies before you actually start what you're doing and do another climate survey or a study at the end to see whether or not you in fact are working better in different cultures. And then your personal interests. Maybe you just really are passionate about certain kinds of things. So folks back there are passionate about transportation. Maybe that's something you think is really cool and you want to find out all these young people are going to grow up to be in transportation. Wouldn't that be cool? Or construction. Now, if you've got that interest and you really, if that's what's going to fuel you, you want to measure that. You want to have that information. So, what else should we assess? If it's not the personal kinds of things, what about the project processes? This is extremely important if what you're doing is new. Let's say you have never had a charter school work with an engineering department before. This is a brand new process. Maybe you have never used young people in the K-12 setting to evaluate or assess a project. You've never worked with youth as evaluators. Brand new. You may want to evaluate that process. You may want to evaluate educational delivery. Maybe for the first time you're going to try Twitter to actually entice young people to do some things or to have your team operate. Maybe for the first time you're going to use some kind of different delivery method that's never been done before. Maybe you want to measure or assess something about the outreach context. Maybe you have never worked with incarcerated youth who might have an interest in the sciences. I would bet NSF has seen very little done with incarcerated youth. Maybe you want to look at educational materials and the way you're delivering them or the way they're available. And that's a process. Maybe you want to look at inclusion. You're trying new things of including new types of people or processes or groups, and you want to measure that. Maybe you want to look at participation. Why people come, why they don't, why they learn, why they don't. Things that are about the actual learner or the participant in what you're doing. It's extremely interesting to me that there are some people who believe they don't have any science in their lives whatsoever. Have you ever run into that? There's no science. I'm just, you know, it's all about people and things. And don't realize that everything they're wearing, everything they're doing is based on science. How do you get people like that to participate in a science initiative? And then attrition. Has anybody noticed that even just on teams of grants that you lose people? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Has anybody noticed on any work team you're on, even if people are there, you may have lost them? Yeah, yeah. So how do you keep this work fresh and new and exciting? How do you manage the tasks so that people want to stay with you? And then third, the thing that of course NSF and others are most interested in is what are these project products, the impacts that come out of what you proposed you were going to do. Are you going to look at learning change? You really want to find out if young people think they now want to be scientists and they didn't before. Well, most people are like, who cares? You know, they may change their mind tomorrow, especially if you use self-report of young people saying, yes, today I want to be a biochemist. Well, we talk to them tomorrow and they want to be a police chief, or the next day they want to be in culinary arts. So, you know, there is something about where young people are at and to what degree things solidify in their minds. And so learning may not be a deep enough impact to actually measure as a product at this point. Behavior change, people are very curious about behavior change. What do young people now do differently because they understand the inquiry process? What do they now do differently because they have participated in something you've done? What do they do differently? And then even more so, the ripple effect. What do their families do differently? What do their schools do differently? What do their communities do differently? What do we as an institution of higher education do differently? What's that ripple effect? And then the big deal is the condition change. And this would be specifically what Mac and Mari were saying this morning about benefiting society. And if you look on that logic model, it's that last column called condition change. And there are three types that I always look for: social, economic, and environmental. And that should be a big E. I see I gave it a little e. There must be something subconscious going on there. Social being the kinds of things about people. human development, human change, the kinds of things around economic that are privileged, whether it's creating or maintaining jobs in a community or bringing in more income or bringing in more tourists, you know, whatever it is. The environmental piece of what is happening for the natural environment. Are we actually getting people to sustain their natural environment, to better understand ecosystem services? Do we have young people who are helping that happen in communities? So this is the one that we tend to see focused on most often right now, especially for large grants or publicly funded grants. I find in the foundation world, we're actually seeing more around social and environmental, and in the government world, we're seeing more around economic. And that is based where the context is. So the social world fits a lot of the foundations based on whatever their mission is. So one more kind of ripple out of what else to measure. You may want to measure organizational development. If your grant or your effort is about changing the way we do business or changing our fiber, as Soko said this morning, we're a pretty Caucasian place to be here. And if our goal is to change that, what do we see in the way of organizational change? Is there a change in infrastructure? Are there some things that have been put in place in order to help make that change happen, that are starting to make that happen? Are there particular changes in finances? Do we see money reallocated or allocated to different places? Do we actually see staff added or changed or moved within the organization to work on this? Do we see changes in policies? Do we see an articulation of public value that's different? So has the articulation of the organization in the past been to having everybody on our billboards that are marketing ISU be middle-class, white, young kids? Or are we seeing diversity in those images? Do we actually see other metrics that we might want to measure? And I'll give you a clue. A good place at any institution to look for those metrics is to the president and the provost. If you can see a metric there that's going to make sense for your grant, you're in very well, because you know that's the kind of thing they're going to want to tell the story about, and you can share that with them. So let's move into the how. This is what you're really more interested in, which is I wasn't trained in evaluation, so how in the heck am I supposed to do this? And I'm going to give you the 50,000 foot level, because bless you, that's the best way that people from a wide variety of disciplines, a wide variety of experiences can start to look at this. So I use 4 steps because I can't remember any more than 4. So I have put them down into 4. The first is to map your project. And you can see I used, what did Mac call it? He called it the heavy weapon. I was going to call it the weapon of mass instruction. That's what a logic model would be. We take the whole project, boil it down into one page to be a graph or a picture that gives you a one-page map of what's actually going to happen. It's instructive in showing you the whole. It could be a 150-page grant, has to fit into one-page logic model. It allows you to map out what your inputs are, your outputs are going to be, your outcomes will be, and the kinds of things that are behind that might be assumptions, etc. Or you may use a concept map. I find that that works relatively well for some folks, especially if you're in design or graphic arts. Folks love to use concept maps as part of that. I also find that you might want to figure out exactly what your grant officer will tell you is acceptable. They may even give you the exact template of what they want. That's a hint. Or they may tell you, you know, the people on the review panel, these are all scientists. They're really pretty squishy about visual stuff, so just write text. You know, so it really depends on the grant officer and what they can share with you that has been funded in the past and what that grant panel looks like. And you can sometimes ask for a list of who's going to be on the grant review panel and see what their backgrounds are. So I know, for example, that folks that are in engineering often like scorecards. And I sometimes will create a project scorecard if I know that there are going to be a lot of engineers in the group or people from the business school. If there are going to be a lot of people from landscape design and architecture, I'll tend to use a concept map or something that's a little more free-flowing. So you'll have to think about what works for you and what your goal is. Then after you've mapped out your project, decide where on that map you are actually going to focus your assessment. So is your assessment going to be about the incomes, the inputs? Are you going to actually measure what inputs come in? How much of that stuff there is? And you can say, as a result of this project, we have raised this amount of inputs. And we actually have a number of groups that are doing that. Our Food and Fitness Initiative and Extension in Northeast Iowa is measuring the exact inputs that come in from the Kellogg Foundation, and 2 to 1 they can show inputs from their partners. That's an important piece of what they're doing. You can decide, are you going to focus on the outputs? Are you trying some really new processes, some new kinds of things that you're teaching or doing? Nobody's ever done it before, and so you need to measure that. So it's back to that what of the processes. Are you going to measure the products or the outcomes, those impacts, or are you going to really be looking at those benefits to society and deciding, as a result of this project, we're going to be contributing towards increasing the amount of female engineers at Iowa State University? Are you going to get way out there and change that culture? After you decide that focus and what your questions are going to be, to what degree do we do such and such? Then you go to the methods. Now, you know this. Anybody in here who advises graduate students on their research, you know, and they go to the method first. I love focus groups. I'm going to do focus groups. Well, what's your research question? Well, I want to find out why people don't come to meetings. Okay, so you're going to have focus groups, which are meetings, to ask people why they don't come to meetings. Makes sense, right? But don't we also do that as scientists? We jump to the methods because oftentimes we really like certain methods, or we're comfortable with that, or it's served us well in the past. Or we know that those methods are really honored. So randomized control trials tend to be one that's honored by certain groups. Do you automatically just jump to that as the only method? So really think about, let your questions of what you want to assess, or what you're being asked to assess, to guide your methods. And then collect and analyze your data. And there are 5 basic methods of that I tend to use, and there are many, many derivatives of it. Observation, case study interviews, secondary data, and survey. And I put survey last because we have kind of like death by survey going on in our lives these days, and so I pull that out as a last one if the others can't give me what I need. And that usually has to do with scale. You know, if I've got a really large scale, it's pretty hard to do some of the other things. And then the last of the 4 steps around assessment is to tell your story. So once you've collected all of this, how do you tell the story in a way that's compelling to a variety of audiences? Not just the grant audience, because if you're doing K-12 youth outreach, outreach means not just the scientists at NSF or our peer scientists. It actually means possibly the youth themselves, the teachers who work with them, the school superintendents, the nonprofit organizations that are working with youth. So you have to think about telling that story in a variety of ways. So here's a little bit more about tips on assessment that I've found over the years. One is that I really like using youth as evaluators. If in fact evaluation is an inquiry process in itself, why wouldn't engaging youth as evaluators or assessors be part of the inquiry process? It's a companion piece. Participatory or empowerment assessment I find is extremely valuable, again, involving the people who are your stakeholders or your audience or your target in the actual design and carrying out of the whole assessment and, in fact, the project itself. So we are often guilty in our culture of creating all kinds of things for K-12 young people or teachers or superintendents or school systems or nonprofits, and we never ask them, in fact, if they even think it's necessary. We never, in fact, ask them to join us in planning it or carrying it out, let alone assessing it or telling the story. So I tend to like to build in an empowerment or a participatory element to make sure it's genuine. You're going to find, though, that NSF doesn't really think that's very important. What really matters to NSF is the science. So you have to have solid science first off. This other stuff is nice frosting around the outside, but unless you have really good science and you're going to really be discovering something new, this other stuff isn't going to carry you through. So this is an extra piece. I love using diverse and multiple methods versus death by survey. And so we're seeing some very interesting things around network analysis, how young people make their decisions around their careers, not just what do I want to grow up to be, or now that I've been exposed to robots, I am going to be an engineer, but really looking at how do young people make those decisions and network analysis of who they talk to and how they form those decisions. And truthfully, a survey isn't going to tell you that. You have to observe them, you have to spend time with them, you have to spend time with the people around them to discover that. So use a variety of methods, not just one. Also, as I've mentioned earlier, some agencies really want experimental approaches. And so I've had conversations with grant officers to say, okay, tell me which kinds of methods you really privilege. What are you most interested in? And I float my ideas by them. So I had one that I had suggested for a Q-sort study, where I really wanted to do Q-sort with folks, and they would do a variety of things, and they said, you know, we really don't know about Q-sort. And I said, so you're telling me I shouldn't go there? And they said, I can't answer that question. They do that sometimes. You ever get that from the grant office? I really can't answer that question. Oh, let me phrase it another way. You're unfamiliar with Q-sort, and so my grant may not be the best way to help you all become comfortable with that. Yes, that would be true. So I had to find another source, another grant source that knew what Q-sort was, thought it might be helpful. Social network analysis was another one. Anytime you use the word social, it gets in the way of some grant review panels even thinking it's worth looking at. So you really have to understand what they privilege, what they prefer, and whether or not you can push them in any way. You may be able to push them by combining your new piece with their favorite piece as a new possible companion. Some other tips, IRB is your friend. Has anybody noticed that? Other people would probably say otherwise. But I've discovered the IRB folks have helped me immensely over the years figure out, because they have worked with so many granting groups. When you're doing K-12 youth outreach, you're working with a protected, vulnerable group of individuals, let alone if you are choosing low resource youth or youth of color or youth in a variety of vulnerable situations, whether it's pregnant females. You really have to spend a lot of time with IRB talking through what is the best way to help these folks be part of the project. And it's getting more complicated because school systems have now added some of their own IRB teams. Some people have discovered that. And so you not only have to work with your institution's IRB, but the institutional IRBs for those groups you might work with. And so start early, because when you're working with or about young people, it's really going to take time to walk through the best ways to make sure that you can get what you need in the way of information and exposure and time with young people or the teachers who work with those young people. And what I've actually seen, sadly enough, is people who have said, I'm not going to measure anything with youth. Because I have to do that difficult IRB process. And so what's happening is we're seeing less work done with youth, and we're actually seeing all secondary sources, and we're not seeing the youth experience directly. And there's pros and cons to that. But I think if you really are interested in what youth think and what youth are looking towards, you need to find a way to involve them in your assessment processes. 10% of grant towards assessment, we heard this morning, 10, 15, whatever it might be. But what that means is you don't write the grant proposal and then call up Mandy and say, Mandy, I now need your help to write an evaluation plan. You need to have Mandy in right at the beginning when you're just starting to conceptualize the grant. And you need to say, okay, we're starting to put this grant together. It's NSF. It's about broader impacts. These are the kinds of things we're thinking, so that the whole piece can be built right into your grant and be seamless instead of this thing tacked on at the end. And I can tell you the grant panels I've been on, anybody who tacks it on at the end or doesn't do it well, sorry, I think it was Mac who said it's better to have no evaluation plan than to have a bad one. So really involve the evaluators early. Supplement youth self-report. That's another one I've learned over the years. Everybody believes a survey is the best way to get data, so we give it to a kindergartner and say, so as a result of our program, what do you think? Kindergartner can't read it, has no idea what it means. You're asking them to report on a behavior. They don't even know what that is. They're just doing it. It was fun, right? So when do we oftentimes use a method that doesn't match what it is that's best for getting authentic information or real information? And you have to think about that, because if you're actually going to be measuring youth, you've got to be sure that you can do things that match them. So I oftentimes will use pictures and have them sort pictures. I oftentimes will do focus groups with them and have conversations. We oftentimes will show them little blurbs of things, ask them their thoughts about it. So there's a real wide variety of methods you can use to get information from youth if that's your goal. But you may find it's better to go to the teachers. It might be better to go to coaches. It might be better to go to the cooks and the janitors who observe young people. It might be better to go to coaches, people in faith-based communities where young people are spending their time to find out what's been going on with those young people. Again, use assessment that's developmentally appropriate. Don't give a very complex model to a first grader and expect them to give you the data they'll just put, this is cool, the red one goes there, the blue one goes there, they can't even read what's on it. So you may need to also add to your grant team someone who is schooled in youth development who can help you with what young people can do at various ages and stages in their lives. And then include, again, the youth development specialists. So we have Jane Kelly here, who are youth development specialists. There are others at ISU and other institutions in the state who work with youth development all the time or can connect you with those people. They're oftentimes in human development departments or in sociology departments, but people who have experience working with young people and can help you decide what are the best ways to work with young people in the ways that you're going to get good data or good projects. And schools of education and departments of education are good spots too. A few more tips. Speak logic modelese. If you don't already speak that language, several of us would be glad to help you learn that. And it takes a while to understand the difference between output and outcome. Assessment should support STEM education and youth development, not one or the other, but both. And what we find is that oftentimes projects from the National Science Foundation support science, but they have no best practices built into them for youth development. Or we have youth development grants that have no best practices for science. And so what you have are under-realized outcomes or failures or opportunities that are absolutely missed. You have to have the integration of the two. And so if you're not a youth development person, maybe you're working with teachers who best understand how to do that. Include stakeholders in all stages of the assessment that you're doing, and I would say even beyond that in all aspects of your project. If this is your target audience as outreach people, you should be very interested in engaging them in all parts of the conversation. Provide evidence in a variety of ways using a variety of methods. I've said that. It's called triangulation. And match assessment reporting to the audience. So I thought it was very interesting. I was in a workshop observing. I was a site reviewer watching the assessment observation. And I noticed that there was a quiz being given, a kind of a pre and post quiz of something that was happening. And I noticed several people in the group, these were actually adults, were just checking off. And it was much too fast to even have read the items. And I talked to the person afterwards and said, did you notice you had about 5 of your 25 people who didn't actually read what you put in front of them? Oh, no, I didn't notice that. After discussion with some other folks, we discovered they were illiterate or had low literacy. And they had been given a written piece to fill out. So they did not even know their audience well enough to know that that kind of written assessment was something that was not going to work well for them. So you have to think about the audience you're working with and what's appropriate there. A few resources that I have for you, and then we'll do a little question and answer. Some resources I've found helpful over the years. The first one is the one that I go to almost all the time, and maybe it's just because I spent almost 20 years with those evaluation folks, is the University of Wisconsin Extension has a website that is for non-evaluators. It's for people who need to do evaluation who don't speak the language. And so there are many tip sheets there. There's an actual self-study course in the logic model. There's actually templates for logic models there. There are many wonderful things that are all either free PDF downloads or you can order your very own hard copy. One of my favorite pieces there is a 4-page evaluation plan. And I oftentimes will use that with people when we're working on grant projects and say, now here are the questions we need to think about that go into a good evaluation. Have we done them all? And then there's a 27 or 29-page accompanying book that goes with that to tell you more about that. There's also a wonderful, it's probably, I want to say maybe about 50 pages of how do we evaluate collaborations? How do you know which part of the team success is your success? Especially if you're a faculty member and you have to report that on your annual faculty review, right? You know, what % of this effort was yours? And there's quite a bit of discussion in there and tips and tools to be able to evaluate a collaboration to figure out who gets credit for which parts of the outcomes. So those are some of the things I found very valuable. And then I brought 3 books that I will pass around briefly that might be of value to you. The first one is called Getting to Outcomes with Developmental Assets. Now, if you're not a youth development person, you're thinking, what the heck is that? In the youth development world, we're trying to evaluate what's good in young people versus what's bad. And there's a series of 40 developmental assets that come out of the Search Institute. And in here are tips and tools and processes and evaluations that can be used to help to assess those. So if really what you're trying to do is help young people make wise decisions about science and science careers, it might be more about the decision-making process that you need to assess than it is whether or not they make the career choice. Because you want to know how you can influence that decision-making process. You may find some tools in here. The next resource I have there is New Directions for Evaluation. This is a series that comes out that's available through the American Evaluation Association 3 times a year, I think, something like that. This issue 106 was on STEM evaluation specifically, and so you may find some pieces in there. And another reason I like this whole New Directions series is because it's written in a what I would call a mid to low academic voice. And so you don't have to unpack a million terms and methodologies to understand it. And so you don't, again, have to be an evaluator to understand this. And then this one is also New Directions, but it's New Directions for Youth Development, and it's defining and measuring quality in youth programs and classrooms. And so if you're not a youth development person, but you are wanting to measure something in a classroom, or you want to measure something in a youth program that already exists, whether it's First Lego League or something like that, this might help you with some ideas as well. And again, on the last thing I have there is there are 2 specific publishing houses that are also known for their assessment and evaluation texts and books and tips, and they're Sage and Wiley, and you can simply just go on their sites and you can find lots of wonderful things. There are probably now, I'm going to guess maybe, this one says number 121 for youth development, this one is 106. I'm guessing there are at least that, twice that many by now of those issues. So some final thoughts. You need to believe in youth development, not just STEM education, to be successful in assessing K-12 youth outreach. This is really about young people as well as it is about the science. And if you aren't passionate about both or have a team that's passionate about both, you will have a hard time being successful of really impacting those young people. Also, there's more to life than a randomized control trial, and I hope that you will experiment with non-experimentals, and you will also take a look at how you could improve upon the randomized control trial. The third one, work with others for more successful assessment. So we've got Mandy and her group there with RISE, and they are very helpful in all pieces. And again, as Mac was saying, the statistics folks, we've got a huge variety of resources here on campus. I'm assuming those of you who have come from other campuses have a wide variety of resources as well. Work with condition change to guide your work. So really, oftentimes, as a scientist, my role is about this wide. I look at transformative learning, conditions of transformative learning in non-formal extension contexts. That's a pretty small piece of the world. And for me to be thinking about condition change and why that matters, what does that have to do with the economy? What does that have to do with social change? What does that have to do with social responsibility? What does that have to do with the natural environment? It can be uncomfortable to think that far out, but that's where our grant partners are at. And that's where our decision makers are at. If we can't show that we're doing something for the economy, we're doing something that is socially beneficial, or we're doing something that's beneficial for the environment, then we're probably going to have a hard time getting funded in this day and age. So I'd love to have some questions or comments. I'll pass around the books. Before you want to hear the panel, what are some questions or thoughts, even if you'd like to share some of your own? We could do mutual therapy, so if you have anything that's been troubling you about K-12 youth outreach or assessing it, or we've got a great variety of people in the room. You probably have all kinds of great solutions for each other. Yeah. The researchers, or, okay, to frame it with the researchers. That's a great question. I had a new faculty member from one of the departments come to my office yesterday and say, why in the world would anybody even be interested in my research in the real world? I'm just a scientist. And so he was having a hard time even conceiving how he would state it or talk about it. And so I think one of the things I found over the years is to really think about what's the legacy you want to leave. What's the legacy you want to leave? If you're truly interested in outreach with young people, what is that? And start with what is it that you would like to leave, and is it really that I want young people to go into my career? I want to make sure there are more young people coming through who really want to be an extension person. Well, then that is going to guide the kinds of questions that I'm going to do for research. Other things or tips more to that question? You've got someone back there? Go ahead. Please. That's a very important message, which is nothing is too small. What is it? Is Margaret Mead that says something about the only thing that ever makes a difference is every little act, or something like that? It's not white. I used to have that T-shirt. I don't remember it. But it's really about, you almost in some ways have to have, I consider myself a public value translator. I sat down with that faculty member yesterday, and by the end of our hour together, he had about 12 different ways he could tell a story that would really make a difference in the world. And what he said is, I never thought my science mattered that much. He was very humble about it, and I said, what do you mean? You could go to Rotary. He was somebody who's studying parenting, and I said, you could talk to every grandparent and parent in Rotary, and you can tell them how the science of what you found, that by what a child does in high school determines how much money they will make, how many children they will have, whether or not they will actually have a safe marriage, a marriage that lasts a while, all those health indicators that are out there. He can show that by the time they're in 12th grade exactly who will and who won't, and predict that. Don't I want to know that as a parent so I can send my kid down the right directions? Don't I want to know that as a grandparent so I can make sure my grandchildren are going down those right directions? He had never realized anybody would really care about his science. So how do we find translators to help us think about, take us out of our humble little slice and help us understand that our humble little slice is really not as humble as we thought? So every one of us is probably part of a social justice or a social responsibility initiative somehow, if you're thinking about inclusion or diversity. And if it's about having a better, fairer world, or it's about making sure people have a chance and a choice who may not have had in the past. So we need to be translators for each other, I think, as part of that. So, yeah, Mandy. Oh, good. I'm glad it was clear. I didn't know if I was hitting that hard enough. Because part of that, too, is that can give you some shortcuts, and that can also give you some things that are easier. So you're going to find with a lot of the out-of-school time youth experiences and groups, you don't have to deal with the same K-12 standards. You don't have to deal with the same IRB situation. You have a voluntary learning situation sometimes, or you have people who are benefactors who really believe in what you're doing, and you're not struggling for classroom time to be able to get in there. So oftentimes working in the out-of-school time environment with young people, or the adults who are working with those young people, can actually have more impact and be less of a logistical headache than doing the K-12 in-school kind of situation. Thanks for picking that up. Part of the kind of indicator question for me is, where are youth at? Where are youth at? Not where are we at, but where are youth at where they are most open to, or we have the best way to get in and spend time with them? Where will we make the most difference? And oftentimes we're not as successful when we come with a plan to lay over the top of the youth wherever they might be, instead of figuring out where they're at and going there. And that can be a challenge, because oftentimes the youth can be ahead of us and we don't know it, or they're speaking a language we don't know. And so another reason to be working with youth workers who have those skills and abilities, who can help you find the best entrees for working with those young people or the organizations that do work with them. So, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And a fun story, I was at a 4-H leaders forum several weekends ago giving a talk and a workshop on the public value of 4-H work. And there was a young man who was a 4-H member who was a junior in high school. And whenever we would break at this conference, there would be about 20 adults in line to talk to him. And I finally said to somebody, what is so special about that young man? And they said, he's on our technology team. They're all standing there with their smartphones saying, I can't get this to work. Can you show me whatever? So how do we also allow that youth voice and that what is special about young people help us guide where we're going to? And again, you have to know what the grant folks will allow you to do and not allow you to do, or find a way to cloak it in the terminology that at least doesn't make them run screaming from the room. I remember applying for a project one time through the Sustainable Ag Research and Extension Program, and I had proposed a total participatory project where we would try to find out how farmers like to learn best and what that means for the work that we as ag educators do. And I put out this process we would use to involve farmers, etc. And I was absolutely amazed it got funded, because every review that came back was, well, we don't see your scientific question, we don't see this and that. Well, you don't have questions yet, because if it's participatory, you work with a group of people to come up with them. But they had faith, they gave me the money, we did it, and we actually had much better authentic results because we had farmers who served on our team, our research team, that kept us where we should be going instead of where we thought we should be going. And that data on that project has a life all its own at this point because those farmers were engaged in it, rather than just me as scientist saying, I know best, everybody just roll over and please help me out. And some people will do that and you still get good data. But I think it's a much richer project if you're able to work with folks who are in the actual experience.